Okay, welcome all. Nice to be here to talk to you about climate change, the economics of climate change. My name is Elbert Dijkgraaf. I'm a professor here since 2009, and before that I studied, like you, economics. Became a research fellow, finally professor. I did 8 years in Parliament, and between 2010 and 2018, and also then I was a professor here. Because I believe that politicians should also be in the real world, and university is a very nice environment to meet people who think about what's happening in reality. So for the people at home, you see here my mobile number. So I have my phone on, so if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and then there's one of the students here who will ask a question. Or you can add me, just what you like. What I want to do today is teach you six things I think you need to know about climate change from an economic point of view. And the first one, why this is not working. Because I think we have this. So, first question is, of course, is there a problem? Yeah, we have a lot of people in this world who say, well, there is no problem, there's no climate change, it's exaggerated, it's used by governments to put all taxes on and to get revenues and to mislead you. Well, my answer would be, if you look at science, it's clear we have a problem. Yeah, look at these pictures you see there in the bottom, the temperature rise since 1880. You see here annual emissions, so that's all emissions from fossil fuels in the world. And then you see here that we got this industrial development, and that since, say, 1900, we have a sharp increase in carbon dioxide emissions. Well, emissions are no problem at all. So it's not the emission that's the problem, it's the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration that's the problem. So emissions are adding to that concentration, and that's rising, and that means that the solar energy coming from the sun is repeating itself. It's not so easy to get out the heat anymore, and that means that the temperature is rising. So the first of the 6 points, I'm very good with that. Yes, we have a problem. Of course, it's a very complex system, our Earth system. We are not only adding as human beings to these problems, we have also volcanoes, we have complex interactions with trees and oceans and so on and so on. You can study in Delft and in Wageningen very nice studies about that. But if we look at it from an economic point of view, then we see, yes, we are, as human beings, adding to this problem. So that's the first point. Are there any questions about that? Doubting that, for instance? No?
Just one thing is, some people argue that like our world has been going through like heat waves and cold waves, and they say all these rising temperatures is just a new heat wave and it will go away. How do you argue against that?
Well, I argue against that it is very coincidental then that we have a sharp increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, so it's rising from 320 to 420. That's directly related to the emissions. So maybe there is also a long-term just change in the temperature giving what's happening in the world without the influence of us. But to be a little bit practical, if we wait until we know exactly what's happening, then maybe 50% of the population is dead. So it's not so good to wait so long. And my second answer always is, even if you doubt climate change and don't believe in carbon dioxide emissions, the current Ukraine crisis proves that it's not so nice to be dependent on fossil fuels, because many fossil fuels are in countries which are unstable from a geopolitical point of view. And that's for me also a big reason, and we knew that already, that it's of course a little bit stupid that a country like Germany is for 50% dependent on Putin. It's not so bad. Yeah. Okay, then the second thing, why is there a problem? How can it be that there is such a problem? And from economics, it's quite easy. Yeah, we have on the horizontal axis emissions. It could be production, but production is related to emissions. So we have here a demand curve, which is decreasing, of course. If the price is higher, we have less demand. We have a supply curve. That's here the private marginal cost curve. And where the two intersect, we have an equality, and the economy is producing this amount of emissions. Well, what's the problem of a market? A market is not internalizing external effects of itself. So if it is the case, and it is the case, I will show that in a minute, that we have external effects and they are not included in the market price, then in fact the social supply curve is this one. Yeah, that's the private marginal cost curve plus the external cost. So the social optimum is far lower than the market optimum. And that's simply the problem from an economic point of view. It's quite simple. So markets function very well, supply and demand, but if not all relevant aspects are in the market system, then you get oversupply and over demand. It's as simple as that. Questions about that? Clear? It's simple economics. So what can economics then do? Well, first, show what the essence is of the problem. So a lot of people don't understand what's happening here, and they think that people are mad or that they're behaving strange or that they make the wrong choices. No. What we do in a market economy is saying to people, okay, this is demand of you and this is supply of me, and we have an equality of the two, and then there is a solution. So people are not behaving strange, that they are reacting just to the incentives we give them from a market system. What can economics also do? Well, I think a very powerful instrument we have as economists is cost-benefit analysis. So first show what the climate change costs and what the benefits are if you solve this problem. Then you know whether you're talking about small numbers or big numbers, whether it's important or not. And there are many studies done about this, I'll come back to that. And that creates awareness. And you see now that the last years, the awareness is rising. People get really attention to this. You see that also from AEclipse organizing this type of lectures. You see that in politics, that people say, well, we have talked a lot about this, but it's becoming really a problem. And economists can add to that, giving information to society, realize that you are creating this problem. And what we can do as economists is make clear what solutions are. So, okay, if this is the essential problem, what are then possible solutions to arrive at the social optimum? And what are costs and benefits of these solutions? We are also in this lecture going to talk about that. Yeah? So cost-benefit analysis, what you're going to do is really valuing what's currently unvalued. You're going to value the external cost that's not currently in the market system. So there are a lot of methods to do that. I'm not going to delve into that. I'm referring to a study later on that gives an overview of the different methods. If you're interested in that, it's quite interesting stuff. But it's not so important currently for the discussion we have. What you should realize is that, it's a favorite of mine, that discounting is very important. So if you're talking about climate change, you're talking about long-term effects. Yeah, the Earth system is not rapidly changing, and then you know from discounting that effects far in the future become, in current terms, very low if you have a positive discount factor. It is normal to have a discount factor. And what you see is that a lot of studies are playing with that. So what I saw in politics is that people who don't believe in this climate effect, they have a very high discount factor. And people who are very much believing it, they don't discount at all. So what we can do as economists is showing what the effect is of discounting on the cost and benefit of the problem and on the different solutions. What you should be aware of, if you're working later on for a government or an international organization or in science, always look first at what do they do with this gap. And I think as a scientist that a proper study should show, okay, this is what I assume as a discount factor, and I show you also if I change it, does it change my conclusions? But nearly no study does that. It's difficult, often, it's in a footnote very often, but it's quite important. So if you want to know what the quality of a study is, first look at what they do with this guy. Yeah.
So you're saying that the discount factor is like really central to all these studies. Like why do we not, like in our masters, we, as you said, like it's just a footnote in the analysis, like we always say, let's just take a discount factor and take it as a given. Like why is there then a dichotomy between what we do as economists and why you think it's so important?
Well, I think that the conclusion is that not enough attention is given to this. And that's why I stress it here, that you're aware of it, that it's very important. I'm teaching in the Bachelor Economics of Sustainability. There I show also with calculations. If you're interested, send me an email and I send you an Excel and you can play with that. But you can all have all different effects if you're playing with this discussion. Yeah, so normally what we have in economics, if we want to invest in a project, then we are calculating the net present value of this project. Well, that's the net benefit of this project per year, and we are discounting that with a positive discount rate R, dependent on time, and if it's larger than zero, we say as economists, okay, it's a good project to invest in, and if it's negative, then you say, no, we are not going to do that. What environmental economics does is just adding this part to this calculation. Yeah, so you're not only calculating the net benefits from a price point of view, but you're adding also the environmental effects. And we have also a very big discussion in environmental economics. This R, should that be equal to this one? Yeah, there is theory that says because, for instance, incomes are growing in the future, and we know from the empirical literature that if incomes are growing, people are going to attach more value to the environment compared to private goods. Yeah, very simply, if you're living in Africa and you have all trouble all day just to earn your bread, well, then you don't have time and money to invest in the environment. And if you're very rich, you have more time to do that. Well, if that's the case, then maybe in the future the value you attach to these effects is higher. You can do that by having a lower discount rate. That's one of the reasons. There are several reasons. It's the theory of Crutilla-Fisher. And, well, there's a lot of discussion going on there. There's one important assumption behind this, if you add these figures up, you say in fact that private costs and environmental costs and private benefits and environmental benefits are substitutes. Yeah, to give a simple example, if you have two projects, one is a windmill, and the windmill has 90 euro per kilowatt hour private cost and 10 environmental cost. And we have a nuclear power plant which has 10 private costs and 90 environmental costs. Well, they cost both 100. As economist, you say then, doesn't matter for me whether you build a windmill compared to a nuclear power plant. As a human being, you immediately say, if they cost the same, then I would think that nearly everyone in this room say, build a windmill. Yeah, but that's the assumption you're making, and that's, especially for non-economists, it's quite a difficult assumption. But if you don't make that assumption, you can't add these figures up. That can also be a reason to have a lower discount rate for environmental effects, because then you're attaching indeed more value to the environmental part, and then in that calculation, the nuclear power plant gets higher cost because you're discounting less. Yeah? So I want to refer to a few studies. At the last sheet, you have the complete references of these studies. So if you're interested, you can find them in the library of this university. It's a nice study of Aufhammer, 2021. Aufhammer says, in fact, if you look in the world, how much time and how much money is invested in research, then a big effort is made in studying the physical effects of climate change. But if you're looking in economic terms, then it's far less. And that's not so good, because in my opinion, we as economists are the only ones in the world that can solve this problem. Sounds a little bit arrogant, I know, because you can also say, well, it's the technicians because they develop these new technologies, and yes, indeed, we need these new technologies. But I'm convinced, and I will try in this lecture to convince you also, that if we as economists, and of course, finally the politicians have to do that, don't include the right incentives in the market system, we never will solve this problem. And the other way around, I'm also convinced that if we do that, if we give the right incentives, then everything will be solved. Because the market always reacts to these incentives. And if it's profitable to develop new technologies, the market will do that. But you have to have the right price signal. So Aufhammer gives a very nice overview of the different methodologies to quantify external effects. So if you're interested in that, then this is really the most up-to-date study to read. The second interesting one is from Toll, Richard Toll. Richard Toll is famous in this type of analysis if you're talking about external effects and energy. He's a very big guy. Well, and he concludes, after referring to the total literature, that there are large impacts on the long term. If you look at it from an economic point of view, that the effects, unfortunately, are larger in poorer, hotter, and lower-lying countries. So we, as the Netherlands, have a problem because half of the country will disappear if you do nothing. But the biggest problems are in some parts of Asia, in mainland Africa, where we have already these big problems. So it becomes even more problematic there to survive, which means also, if you don't believe in this climate change issue and you don't solve the problem in Africa, even if it comes from normal changes in the world system, then we get bigger migration streams from Africa to Europe than we have now. A few years ago, I visited Ethiopia, and then of course, then you're also looking at these figures, and the population of Ethiopia will double in the coming 20 years. And now it's already problematic to get a job for these people. Even if you're very selfish, in my point of view, even if you're not giving anything about the environmental effects, well, then also you should do these things to solve this, because else we get very problematic migration streams. He concludes also that if you look at what an optimal carbon tax is, that it is between several tens and hundreds of dollars per ton. Remember that, because I will show you in a minute what we are currently giving for a price signal in the market. Yeah? So then there is an interesting study of Perry with his team, and that's an IMF study. And what they do is they inventorize the current price signals in all countries in the world. So they say a proper price would be the private cost plus the external cost plus the normal consumption tax. That last one is a bit strange perhaps, but it's okay, because we need consumption taxes to have income for normal goods, so also for energy. So that is what the price should be. And then they have an inventarization of the prices in the different countries. And then they conclude, after a lot of study, a lot of work, that there are massive subsidies, in fact, going to fossil fuels. So in fact, they are saying, okay, you have these private costs, but even these private costs are subsidized in many countries. The external costs are in many countries not internalized, and often there is also no consumption tax. So then I come back to my first figure. If you have that with the external cost, well, then you shouldn't be amazed that you're emitting far more than it should be from a social point of view. They conclude also with this empirical analysis: if you introduce the right prices, so internalize the external effect, and don't subsidize anymore, then carbon dioxide emissions will decrease with 36%, and that a maximum of 1.5 degree rise is possible. So that's the only thing you have to do, they said. And I agree. Yeah.
But then you have all the subsidies mainly in the oil-rich countries. Like, you know, you probably not convince a Qatari to.
I come back to that. Because where are the subsidies especially high? In Asia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. They are not so high in Saudi Arabia because they want to maximize the price. But if you look at Asia and the Commonwealth of Independent States, that's this interesting combination of countries. Well, they have very low prices. And I come back to that international problem because I think that that is, in fact, the only real problem we have. There is international differences between countries, which is quite difficult to solve. They are especially high for coal and for power generation. Well, coal is the most problematic fossil fuel source. In power generation, we need a lot. So we really have a massive problem. Well, some details, I'm not going into that. If you're interested in that, read the paper. There's a lot of information about that. So you have explicit subsidies, that's undercharging private costs. You have implicit subsidies, that's not internalizing the external effect. And what they do, in fact, if they look at the implicit subsidies, so the externalities, they look at global warming, but also local air pollution and factors like the result from more energy is more transport, is more accidents, more congestion, rural network. So they have a really complete picture of the external effects. Okay, to end this discussion, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions by sector, then it's clear that energy is 3/4 of the problem. So it's really concentrated in the energy sector. Of course, we have other sectors. Look here at agriculture, forestry, land use, it's 18%, waste is 3%, industry is 5%. But it's really, you have to solve this. Yeah, it's an energy problem. Okay, that's the second thing I want you to know. Why there is a problem. Clear? Then, this is very interesting, I think. The third point is, okay, this is not a new problem. I was born in 1970, a long time ago for you, and this is 1973. I remember that. That's not honest, because I can't remember that. I think I'm not that clever that at the age of 3 I read already this problem, but when I was 12 or so, I read about these issues, and then we had the first oil crisis. OPEC was producing less, and oil prices went sky high, and we had an economic crisis in the world. That's the first red line. The second one is the second oil crisis. The third one, around the 90s, is also an oil crisis. And the interesting thing is that from this point on, we had a lot of international conferences, not about climate change, but about the question, how can we be less independent on fossil fuels? And that was not, we then didn't know the climate change problem. We knew, okay, we have a problem because we are dependent on countries that we don't like. So a lot of policies came from that. Governments were subsidizing things, taxing things. We had, since 1992, 26 international conferences. And look down at the black line. Yeah, so we have 50 years of discussion between government, within countries, in science, about less dependence on fossil fuels. And in fact, the only thing what you see is an increase at world level. So, didn't we do anything? No. So this is the same picture, emissions, but now from the Netherlands. And you see here that we have the first oil crisis here. This is the second one. So you can say that 50 years of discussion for the Netherlands at least resulted in a sort of stabilization of the use of fossil fuel. It's now the last few years decreasing. We hope that it's further decreasing by building more windmills and solar parks and so on. So you can say, okay, this is not great, but it's also not bad. It's not that rising figure we had from a world level. So how does this come? Well, you see here Europe. When Europe stabilizes, or if you're positive, you say, well, maybe this is really a decreasing trend. We always say the United States are the bad guys. It's not true. They show the same picture. They're also decreasing. They're also investing in renewable energy. So the real rise is China and India. And then maybe we have the picture that China is a terrible country if you look at energy. Well, there are more windmills and solar parks built in China than in the rest of the world. But the economic increase is even larger, which means that although they invest a lot in renewable energy, they use also more fossil fuels and thus carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, because some economists have been pointing out that there has been like this decoupling process in Europe where we reduce our production, but also that's because we are outsourcing our production to countries like China and India. So, because I see like when Europe and United States are like decreasing emissions, it's where China and India are increasing.
That's what we did. So a very big part of the stuff we use daily in the Netherlands is produced in China. So we can say, it's not good what you do. Well, it's our stuff. And we know all these figures, and it's true. So we rebuilt our economy from an industrial economy to a more service economy. But then it means that elsewhere in the world, these emissions are going up. And the strange thing in the thinking of the regulatory systems is that we look at it from a national perspective. So I had a lot of discussions in Parliament about, okay, we solved the problem here, but then we are creating maybe a bigger problem there. Yes, they say, that's true. But in the international agreements, we are only looking at the national goals. Yeah. So and that's what we can add, I think, as economists, to analyze that very sharply and to come up with proposals to solve these issues. Because we have to solve them. How do you get this? So my conclusion is that a problem exists for a very long time, and that means that if we are going to do the same as the last 50 years, then nothing changes. So maybe you are thinking, okay, we are the new generation and we are going to do it better. Well, we saw that in the past. But we didn't arrive at the optimal situation. So you have to do better than we. If you figure for 2019, and it's a share of carbon dioxide emission, and you see that currently the level of China is 28%, the rest of the world 21%, United States 15%, India 7%, Russian Federation 5%, and the rest is less than 5%. So my conclusion would be that this problem of climate change will persist as economic growth continues, as poor countries also want to profit from cheap fossil fuels as we did. Yeah, our economies in the Western world and the OECD, the United States, Australia, Europe are built on cheap fossil fuels. And if you now say to countries in Africa and in China, okay, you are not allowed to do that, they say, well, yes, nice. You profited from it, and now we can't. We don't do that. And that's, in fact, the essence of the international coordination problem. If you don't solve that, we will see the same picture as we have seen in the last 50 years. And we have a problem that oil, coal, and gas producing countries want to sell. Yeah, we have countries in this world which have sand and oil, and they can't sell the sand, so they sell the oil. And they will do everything to sell until the last drop. So if you have to tackle that problem also, we have to give them another earning model. Else they will do that. Yes, so that's the third one I want to tell to you, that we have really a long-term problem. Let's see. fourth one is, the problem is really international. So you have a lot of problems in environmental issues which are very local. I did a lot of studies about the waste problem, so waste collection, recycling, prevention, whether you should sort the waste at home or in a factory. A lot of interesting discussions. It's quite easy because you can do that locally. It's your local problem, and then you can solve it. That's for noise, that's for nitrogen. The problem with carbon dioxide emissions is that if you solve the problem in the Netherlands, but if then that means that there is a problem in Belgium or in India or in China, then you didn't solve anything. You cleaned your own room, but it's still a mess in the house. There's nothing solved. And carbon is, we can't change that, it's a physical aspect. Carbon is, per definition, international. The emissions are just going to the layer above us, and whether that's produced in China or in the Netherlands doesn't matter. So local solutions are nice, and I think that, especially in the European Union, we are investing a lot in local solutions. So one of the very interesting things is that because we have national goals in the Netherlands, we are closing our coal-fired electricity plants, and that sounds very nice, but that means that there is more production of brown coal in Poland, and they have very old factories, and we are closing factories built in the last 5 years. So if you're looking per kilowatt hour of electricity, the emissions are there 4 times higher than here. So we are investing billions in that because we have to compensate these private owners. If we should have been a little bit cleverer, then we should have taken these billions and go to Poland or to Africa or to China and say, can we close these old factories and build new ones? It's not what we're doing, because we have an agreement in the European Union that we have national goals. And everyone should add to the solution. But that's not so efficient from an economic point of view. I understand it from a political point of view, but we are economists here. And I think as economists, we should think better about regulation systems that are acceptable for politicians and are efficient. That combination is, I think, the key to success, but also quite difficult. So what we as economists do not so very good is that we like to analyze simple solutions because we can handle that with our brains. And then we say to the politicians, you're stupid. You're choosing the wrong things. Well, they will be always stupid because they have to be elected, and we as scientists not. If you want to be clever, we have to find systems that integrate those. So the problem is international. I assumed here an inelastic supply of oil. Can be coal, can be gas. Let's take oil. Yeah, that means that if the price is going up, the supply doesn't change anymore. So that's not true in general, because if the price is going up, the production will increase because more technologies are profitable from a private production side. But probably there is some point where the supply becomes completely inelastic or very inelastic. And the interesting thing is that if that's the case, and this is not what always is the case, but it's an example of what's happening at least often. If you're at the part of the inelastic supply, and then you have, for instance, in the Netherlands, a demand ex ante, and then we talk a lot about new renewable policies, which means that demand is decreasing, okay, then we get a lower price, but we don't get a lower production. And why is that? Because the price is going down and more is consumed in countries that don't have this policy. Yeah, so we invest in billions in new renewable energy. Prices are going down, which means that China consumes more oil because it's cheap.
Which is happening right now.
Yeah, of course. It's happening all the day.
Like with Russia now, I mean.
Sorry?
Because of the sanctions in Russia, actually, India and China are already.
Yeah. But also in a normal situation. And if you're the owner of Saudi Arabia, of course you want to sell the oil at the highest possible price. But if half of the world is investing in renewable energy, they still want to sell this oil. So we have to include these countries in a deal to solve the problem really. So my conclusion for this is, if you really want to solve the climate change issue, then international cooperation is essential.
We have a question online. What do you think about degrowth for developed countries? And is there anything in the research about a threshold up to which an economy is considered sufficiently developed and stable to ensure everyone's basic needs so that it is feasible for them to approach degrowth? How does degrowth inscribe itself in an international context?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of discussion going on about degrowth, so less growth. The cynical answer is that if you want to have that, people should be convinced to do that. And if I travel to China or to India or to Africa or to the United States, then I don't see many people who want to do that. They want to develop and they want to increase their income. So that is how we build our economic system. The second answer is, why did we at least stabilize our emissions in the European Union, in the United States? That's because we are able to invest in new technologies. You need a lot of money for that. It's expensive. Yeah, if you compare let's take the example of Poland with the brown coal and the coal-fired electricity plant in the Netherlands. We can spend billions on that. Poland can't do that. So I don't think that growth, well, in theory, it's degrowth a possibility, but I don't think it's in practice.
That's one question, because we see that there's a lot of money for subsidies. Why is that not used? I think like figures of like 10 times the amount like is paid in subsidies, what would be like kind of the yearly budget for energy transition. Read that figure somewhere. Like, why is that not happening? Like, because the money is there. I think that's like the money is there for subsidies, but not for other kind of actions.
Yeah, well, one of my frustrations in politics was that if you look at the Netherlands, then 98% of the budget was used to build existing technologies, so windmills, solar farms. Well, my point of view was we have to invest large sums of money in new breakthrough technologies, because it doesn't help that much to build now a windmill. So we have to solve a world problem, and to solve the world problem, then newer, cleaner technologies are better. The answer was again, yes, but we have to reach these national goals. And we can only reach them when we close the coal-fired electricity plant and build new windmills and build new solar farms. So it's not so nice answer, but it's a reality. Then the fifth thing, can economic instruments solve the problem? And the answer is yes, easily, in theory. Yeah, so in fact, if you look at the literature, and it's a massive literature, and you draw simple conclusions for that, and abstract from all difficult things, then in fact you should do two things, what we were discussing just. So, investing in new technologies, because what does the market? The market look at current prices, at expected prices in the future, and then they decide how much they invest in new technologies. So when I talked in the past as a researcher with electricity companies in the Netherlands, I asked them, okay, how do you include the subsidies in your decision system? They said, we don't. Because we only know the current subsidies, but we don't know what future governments will do. And that means if you look at innovation, that the market, as long as you haven't solved that pricing problem, will invest less in innovation than you would see otherwise. And that's not a problem of the market, it's a problem, again, of the pricing system. And even if the pricing system is perfect, then it's also the question of whether the private market still invests enough. It will invest more. But is it enough? Well, for instance, if you're looking at scale effects, that's very difficult for a private investor. So Tesla did that with the load infrastructure for Teslas. But that's in fact, to be dishonest, a solution for the few rich. Because not many people can buy a Tesla. So we need a load infrastructure which is far bigger and far more accessible for a larger share of the population. You see that private parties don't do that. That's not enough. So if you have technologies, and often these renewable technologies have high cost in the beginning, and the costs are decreasing because of technological development. If you look at a solar panel or a wind park, then the costs were 10 years, I think 3 times higher than now. That's just because of technological development. And at the first part, then for private companies, it's very difficult to invest. So that's the part where public investment, public subsidies is quite important to get these new technologies and to get these decreasing costs. And the second thing you have to do is simply internalizing external effects. So it's the first thing I showed you. You can do that by taxes or by tradable permits. Yeah, so if I come back to that picture from the beginning, then we had here the private market solution because no external effects were internalized. We have here the optimal solution, and economists say then, okay, but then you have to have a tax between this level and that level. Or a price incentive from a tradable permit system that's this size. If you do that, then, well, in fact, this curve doesn't exist anymore because you have included this tax, and then immediately you get a solution at this level. It's as simple as that. So what we know from microeconomics, that tax is very efficient. because incentive is equal for all participants in the market, which means equal marginal costs. And then we have Pareto efficiency. What good is from a tax is that we know ex ante what the effect on the price is. It's clear, because, well, that's in the law. What not so nice is that with a tax, you don't know what the effect is on emissions. Okay, from a theoretical point of view, we know. But of course, in practice, we don't know all these curves exactly. We don't know exactly how people are going to behave. So we make an estimation. But often we are amazed by what the market is doing, and we have underpriced some effects and overpriced other effects. And that means that if you introduce a tax, you're certain about the price, but not certain about the effect. And that's in fact what an alternative system does, tradable permits. You have heard in your study about GOES. So what GOES, Nobel Prize winner, said is, if you have a problem because something is unpriced in the market, that means in fact that there is no ownership. Nobody owns this. So if you introduce ownership rights, then the market will solve the problem immediately. No matter whether you give it to the polluters or to the polities, doesn't matter, there will be a negotiation in the market, and there will be a pricing of this new property right. And that's in fact what the European Union did. They introduced a European trading system. It exists since 2005. So I come back to the essentials of the system in a minute. It has the same pro as the tax. It's efficient because the marginal costs are equal for all companies. There's one price of emitting carbon dioxide emission. A pro is also that you're very certain, exactly certain about what the effect on the emissions is, because that is what is in the law. Now you're not so sure what the effect on the price is. So then it's whether you're choosing for a tax or for tradable permits, it's in fact a choice. Do you want to be sure about the price or about the effect? And my point of view is, if you look at climate change, you want to be about the effect. That's the most important thing. But if you look at the effects on the wallet of people, well, then it's not so nice that you're not sure about the effect on the price. So, the European trading system introduced the right to emit 1 ton of carbon. Yeah, so you're buying the right, and if you have that right, you are allowed to emit 1 ton of carbon. You have a factory, you're calculating, okay, I think I produce this much this year, which means that it emits that much tons of carbon, then I'm buying the rights in the market. So it's just on a stock exchange. Then you can buy this today and sell it.
How easy is this to like monitor?
Sorry?
Is it easy to monitor, say like factory, how much is emitting? Can they get around it?
Yeah.
Example, like bulk
No, it's quite easy monitored. You know how much energy is going in.
Yeah.
You know how much energy is in the product. So from a technical perspective, that's quite close. Of course, there will be some playing with, but if you do that, you get a very high fine. So
what if you don't like Volkswagen didn't get caught for years with their emissions testing? I know it's not the factory, but like with their cars, they were saying like, I don't know what they did with it, but like they changed.
Like Volkswagen did, it's the software and yeah. But you see also the penalty for Volkswagen. So you can do it.
It's risky.
But it's quite risky, and they had billions of claims. And that's, of course, in nearly every regulation system, you have these issues. But given digitalization, you can far easier see this type of things than in the past. You can measure more, we can calculate more, you can see strange patterns in data. So it helps. So you buy the right on the market. What the European Union decides is the number of permits. And that's why you can influence these emissions, because you're deciding on that. And you say, okay, for this year it's 100, for next year it's 95, and it's 90, and you can do that for several years, and then you know beforehand that emissions will go down, because there are no more permits than that. So it's obligatory above some scale of production. It's for electricity, heat, energy-intensive industry, commercial aviation within the EEA region. And what we learned from history, that, okay, it's a very nice system, but it's sometimes difficult to reduce enough. You see that here? So this is the price of these permits between April 2008 and April 2001. You see here the introduction of the system. It was around 25-30 euro. That was a nice price at that time, because then people like Richard Tobel, who studied the external effect, thought, well, it will be in the range of 30 euro per ton. That was the price, so that was quite nice, because then the price was internalized. And then we got a financial crisis, which means that demand of these permits went down in the European Union, because we had less production, same supply, demand decreases, so prices collapsed. And then we needed between 2009 and 2018 in the European Union to get the right level of permits. So especially Eastern European countries and Southern European countries didn't want to decrease the number of permits anymore. So the European Union could have said at that moment, okay, demand is going down, then we decrease supply. You can't do that immediately, that's not legal, but you could have done that around 2012. But they didn't agree with that, and the Eastern European countries and the Southern European countries didn't want to tax their industry anymore. You can imagine that. There was unemployment, they had problems with people losing their jobs. Companies went bankrupt, and if you have them at high price level, then they get easier bankrupt, so you have a bigger problem. So this was really a political problem. Until the crisis faded away, and then you see immediately here they simply decreased the number of permits, and they increased the sectors for which a permit was obligatory, and then you immediately see that the prices increases to 42 euro per ton of carbon dioxide emissions in April 21. And here you see a picture of, here is April 21, then we were at 42, and then you see here that it became around 90. This is? Yeah? Yeah, the green wall. And you see that immediately in these, because then people think, okay, we have an economic problem, so demand's going down, and you see immediately the price goes up, goes down. And here, in fact, you see that the market believes that the problem is not that big. So you can learn two things from this issue. I was teaching in these years, and then colleagues of mine said, okay, the system doesn't work. I was not so sure about that. I was also not very positive, because then I talked a lot about these politicians not doing their jobs. With the current knowledge, I said, okay, maybe you need to have the guts to give the time to the politicians to arrive at a new system. Yeah, so often economic instruments need time to do what they have to do. So if you have an evaluation here from economists, at this point of time, economists would say, stop the system, introduce tax. If with a tax, the politicians would have done the same. They would introduce no tax or a very low tax. But this is not an economic instrument problem, this is a political problem.
I think this is like an interesting way of pricing this. But then also you see that there could be like carbon leakage from like we have very strict rules and we don't want them to pollute. So then indeed maybe things will be produced in other countries which don't have these permits. And then I think the EU gives like free pollution permits to companies to still stay here and produce here, which actually makes them benefit from the fact that we have these trading schemes. And also like the European taxpayer has to pay that money, of course, for the subsidies. So how do we, what's your view on that? How, like, how can we do that better? And we still want them to stay here, or maybe they can leave, but then they will like go to like less strict countries. So how do we keep them here without us having to pay those subsidies? Or
yeah, very good question. I come back to that in the sixth point, because I think this is really the problem where we are now. So we have proven in the past here that we can introduce an instrument that works. Because if you look at, remember the work from Toll, he said the carbon price should be in the tens of euros or hundreds. If you look at what currently costs a windmill, it's 30 euro per ton carbon dioxide. Solar is 80, sequestration, so that's putting the carbon dioxide emissions below the surface of the Earth. That's around 90. And then you see that the price is between 80 and 90. That's good. It means that the market can invest in these renewable energies. So at least we have proven that we partially can solve the problem. But then comes your problem about carbon leakage. In fact, I agree with most questions of you. What I don't agree, I think, is giving these permits for free to companies. We don't like that because we give a lot of money then, in fact, to these companies. But in fact, it's still very costly for these companies. That sounds rare, but if you get one permit as a company, then it's on the balance sheet immediately. So it's then on the balance sheet currently for, say, 80 euro. And then from a private economic perspective, the company has still to answer the question, do I go on with production or do I sell this permit to the market? But still the incentive is there to minimize the emissions, because if they minimize the emissions, they can sell it to the market and they have money. So this is not about efficiency, this is about equity. And we don't like to give a lot of money to the people who are emitting, I agree with that, but that's not about the real effect on emissions, that's the same. That's exactly the difference between a tax. We like a tax because then the polluter pays. And with these rights, the polluter pays if you don't get them for free. But from a point of international competition, you sometimes have to give them for free, else they are moving to another country, producing maybe even more pollution. Let's see whether that's a student or. Let's see. Oh. Okay. Yeah, we're going to discuss that point of view of international competition. Clear? So we are not the only ones who have such a system. That's also the good news. We have also such a system in California, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. More and more countries are introducing this system. I looked up the prices of March 15, and then you see that's 81 in the EU, and that's a lot lower in California, Australia, and South Korea, somewhat higher in New Zealand. So these countries are struggling with the same thing. How many permits do we give to the market, and what does that mean for the price? But at least you can't say that the European Union is doing this alone. And maybe it's possible in the future to couple these systems and to have one system. Then we are not there, but it helps. So should there be then any regulation in this? Well, the literature says very clearly last week there was an interesting report from the CPB, that's a Dutch economic independent bureau, like the IMF for international things, and they made very clear if you have such a permit system, then the total emissions are regulated. If you're then saying, okay, but I want also rules for, is it allowed to have coal as a fuel? Or should we stimulate renewable energy or biomass? Or should we set strict quantity rules for factories? That means, in fact, in economic terms, that you're decreasing the efficiency. Because then marginal costs are not anymore equal. So you're choosing as a government which technology is applied. The market should do that. Then you have the largest effect with the lowest amount of money. And nearly every rule you're adding to that is adding to inefficiency and thus cost money. Well, I can guarantee you that my colleagues in Parliament don't like it. They want to have rules and rules and rules because they think, well, now I can control this and I don't like biomass and I don't like coal. I want wind. So that's, from an economic point of view, not so clever. Unless you say, yes, it might be efficient, but I find it unacceptable that some fuels are used. That can be, it's not economics, but it's from an ethical point of view, you say, well, I don't want to have this. I don't want nuclear power, or I don't want brown coal, or I don't want coal at all. It's possible. It costs money, but that is allowed. Or you have to build up networks. And networks have scale effects, which means that you have to include, for instance, if you look at the greenhouse horticulture in the Netherlands, that's using carbon dioxide emissions as a growing substance for the horticulture, well, then maybe you should concentrate these companies at a certain region, because else you can't pay for the network. That's a valid economic incentive to say, okay, I do want to have regulation. Clear? Then we have a very interesting paper from Arvaniti and Hapla. And they give an analysis of welfare if there is international coordination. So we know now we can have systems for countries or even regions. And they say, okay, you have these international cross-border spillovers. Yeah, so if you do something in the Netherlands, then companies have the incentive to go to another country where you don't have this regulation or price. So if that's the case, then you should maybe cooperate internationally and say, okay, let's make a deal. Is their welfare improving? In practice, they say yes, it's over improving, but then they have a very in-depth analysis, and they say yes, but if you look at what people do, the negotiations are prone to manipulation, that you easily can get into a prisoner dilemma, because if you go to this negotiation table, it's from a selfish perspective nice to undervalue what you can do. You say, well, I have problems and I don't have the possibilities you have, and I'm in a difficult situation, and because you want to minimize what you have to do compared with other countries. That's, yeah, you can like it or not, but that's what's happening in negotiations. And then you get in a prisoner's dilemma, and they prove that if you have differences in marginal abatement costs, so let's for instance compare Sweden with the Netherlands. Sweden has a lot of carbon dioxide free energy because they can use water as a source for electricity, because they have a lot of rivers and falling water. We don't have that, which in fact means that our abatement cost curve is higher than for Sweden. If you look at the United States, well, if you look at Texas, they have a lot of possibility to use solar energy as a major source of renewable energy. We don't have that, not in that quantity. So per definition, there are differences in marginal abatement cost, and what they prove is, okay, that's not a problem, but then you should compensate the countries with the higher marginal abatement cost, else you don't get an agreement. And that's exactly the problem. Politicians don't like that. So you remember the discussion, I think, in the European Union when Greece got an economic problem, when Italy got an economic problem, when France got an economic problem, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. So we had a lot of discussion of money from us to them. And now we have to do that at a world scale. Yeah, we have in fact to pay Africa to use their solar energy. Well, look at the discussion about development aid. It's only a very small part, 0.7% of GDP in the Netherlands. It's even less currently. The norm is 0.7, it's currently, I think, 0.5 or 0.7. It's nothing. But a lot of discussion going on just about that. And my major position is, okay, we can solve these issues. We have the economic instruments. What we haven't solved yet is this international cooperation and this international trade. And that means that you have to realize how big the problem is, and that you can't solve it on your own. And in my view, politicians are now waiting for each other, and it's a big negotiation problem. Who is paying this bill? So they conclude that cooperation indeed leads to lower emissions, but they say also, and it's a theoretical analysis, so it's a very nice paper to read. It's not the end of the discussion. Yeah, it's one contribution to the literature. You can add to that and you can discuss that, but at least with their theoretical model, they say, okay, if we look at the differences in abatement cost between the United States, European Union, and China, we don't see a Pareto improving possibility. And that's, I think, nearly per definition true, because I hope you remember Pareto improving means a solution where everybody gets better. We like that, of course, and we should have solutions where you and I, both of us, should be better than we are both happy. But they conclude, in fact, that's not possible. Which means that one country pays the bill for another country. We don't like that. The positive thing is that they say, well, it can be Pareto improving if you have bilateral agreements. They are not very extensive about this. I don't know, to be honest, whether this is a conclusion of sound scientific analysis or a byproduct of, because I think their main analysis is about form form. But in fact, they say if you have to have one big agreement between all countries in the world, there are so many differences that it's very difficult. So they say it's maybe easier in practice to have these bilateral agreements. But we have to see. I see that for economic analysis in the future, there is a lot of room in this type of analysis to see what possible options are and what clever instruments are to internalize effect, this external effect. So if you look at the experience, I see 6 messages in the chat, but there are no new questions. So the first climate conference was in 1992, Rio de Janeiro. And then you see all these people flying in with the private planes, so it's always a very nice picture. Yeah, so we're talking about climate change, we don't have a digital meeting now, all these presidents have their private jets and emit a lot of carbon dioxide emissions, but that's a little bit cynical. I know you have to meet, and it's good that they have these international conferences. But then you see, at the end of such a conference, 1992, a text like, we need ongoing scientific research. Oh yes, nice. I don't need a meeting for that. As a scientist, I say that always. Yeah, we have to have ongoing scientific research, yes. And regular meetings, negotiations, and future policy agreements. So they decide, in fact, nothing. They say it's important. Yeah, but not we should diminish carbon dioxide emission, or we should introduce economic instruments, or nothing at all. In fact, the last COP, Glasgow 2021, it's better, but it's the first climate deal to explicitly commit to reduce the use of all coal. If you remember, in the last day there was a big negotiation on, because there was a text on the table which said coal should be forbidden, and then the Prime Minister of India blocked it. Because they are just using coal. It was dramatic for their country, and there was no compensation at all for India. Yeah, well, then you can expect this. So that's the slow pace of international cooperation going. But if you compare it, okay, it's nearly 30 years later, but it's better text. And we have these national goals, so we are moving, but the point is we are moving quite slowly. And my point is that I think that economists can help to speed up this music if you come up with more clever instruments. So, your point about carbon leakage. With the European Union system ETS, until now, there is no solution for carbon leakage. So, goods produced in the European Union emitting carbon dioxide emissions in big plants need to have this permit, so they have to buy it. If goods come from China, they don't have to buy it. We can't oblige them. But now there is the discussion going on, and it looks really like we are going to introduce that we have a carbon tax for imported goods in the European Union. Then your point is even more important. How do you calculate that? Because a refrigerator is coming in. How much carbon is there in this production of a refrigerator in Shenzhen, China, in that factory? But even in China, if you look at the literature, there is a lot of monitoring from authorities for these factories, a lot of databases built up. So, okay, you can't do it perfect, but it helps to have an equal market between China and Europe. Which means also that there will be an export subsidy for exported goods out of the European Union. And that's in fact, China of course doesn't like that. And then we can say to China, okay, if you don't like that, let's talk about a big system where you also pay for this carbon. And in fact, they have. So we talked about countries. In fact, if you look at solving this climate change problem, then the real term is inequalities. Yeah, inequalities between people, between regions, between countries makes it more difficult to introduce these instruments. Because within our country, we have the same discussion. So if you're talking about increasing the tax on petrol, then immediately we're going to discuss, okay, rich people can pay for that, but what about poor people? Can't they drive their car anymore? And I understand completely this discussion, which means that you have to talk about, should there be exemptions, should there be subsidies? And it's exactly the same outcome, that if you want to solve this, you have to subsidize from rich people to poor people, within your country, within a region, and between countries. And if you don't want to do that, well, you can't solve. That's not true in general, because China experimented with a tradable permit system in different regions in China for years. It worked, and their conclusion was, okay, it's efficient, it works, but we don't like it from an equity point of view. So regions with low abatement cost profited, regions with high abatement cost had a problem. So they introduced a rather complex system. It's a variant on the tradable permit system, but it's technology dependent. So if you have a factory, at the beginning of the year, the government is calculating, okay, you're producing electricity with gas. If you have an efficient system, you need so many permits to produce that. If you get these, at the end of the year it's calculated again, and if you produce less emissions, you can sell the difference between the emissions you got and the emissions you need on the market. And if you produce more emissions, you have to buy them. So that's a variant on the trading system. It's not that bad. But again, what I told you about, if you add regulation to such a tradable system, you decrease inefficiency. That's here the same. And they do it deliberately because they want to have more equity between regions. But they calculated that, if I remember well, around the cost of this system arise with about 25%. But if you want that, and there are reasons to want that, then it's at least possible. So, this is my dream. If you ask me, okay, between now and 5 or 10 years, what is the dream paper you want to produce, then it's this. And I'm at the very beginning, so if you have clever ideas, I like to see that, because I think I'm not clever enough to write this paper. Maybe you are. If you look at the big problems in the world, then they are, in my point of view, climate change, inequality, and migration. So inequality within our Western societies, between poor people, rich people, it's increasing and increasing. You see that also in the upcoming of populist parties in Western countries. If you look at the last elections in Rotterdam, in the poor neighborhoods, only 18% of people went to vote. 18. So they don't believe the government anymore. So then you have a real problem. We have that between countries, Africa, European Union, China, India, and so on. At least from Africa, that leads to a lot of migration. And then I say, well, if I can connect these things, and a very simple example, if I give all world citizens an equal amount of emission rights, well, then in rich countries they don't have enough rights, and in poor countries they have more rights than they need. But they can sell them to the rich people, and you get a financial stream from the rich people to the poor people. It's the same within a country. Yeah?
How fair is that? Giving like a monetary value to their rights, basically they can sell them because they don't have any money to, I don't know, sustain their living, and then they just sell their rights, and then are they really pushed to become less poor then? Saying that then the rich people can just keep on polluting, and then how do they ever develop if they can just sell their rights?
I see many problems in practice. If I dream in theory, then I say, okay, then I give these rights to people in Ethiopia who are living on in very poor circumstances. They can sell that to rich people in the Western countries. Then they have money, which they can use to invest in economic development, in that their children are able to go to school, which is currently not the case for hundreds, millions of people. That they are able to invest in building up a business. And then you say, well, maybe if they are going to develop economically, then they need these permits again, because they're going to emit, well, then you hope that you give them the incentive that they build up their lives far more sustainable than in Western countries. At least, but this is the answer. I'm not convinced yet. My point would be, I think that if you conclude that the only possibility to solve the issue really is that you have to involve not only the rich countries, but also the poor countries, not only the rich people, but also the poor people, then you have to think about financial streams between these groups. Else you will never solve it. And we are not very far in science to think about these things, often because I'm in this phase myself. It's very easy to say it's too complex. We will never arrive at a solution. Well, we solved that before we had tradable permits, and some scientists invented this system. It works. So we have to develop, I think, the thinking in this direction further. Okay, this is the last one for me, and then what is to you for any questions left. Very shortly, we have discussed it already, I think. Ukraine. Well, what you saw is that the Ukraine war broke out, oil prices went sky high, not extremely high. We had them in the past also above $100, so it was not the only event resulting in this, but you see immediately the reaction. What is more important, I think, that you saw that the welfare function in economic terms changed. Yeah, where immediately discussing was, okay, but geopolitical reasons are more important than environmental reasons. So politicians immediately say, okay, I don't know whether I'm going to close this carbon dioxide or a coal-fired electricity plant. Germany said, okay, we have decided to close these nuclear power plants. We're going to postpone this decision. Timmermans from the European Union, who is very investing in green policies in the last 10 years, said, well, maybe we have to slow down this sustainable process because now geopolitics is more important. I think this is a short-term issue. My feeling is that it might speed up the music and have the opposite effect on the long term, because finally people realize that we shouldn't be dependent on Putin or Arabic shites or this type of people who are not very democratic. That might stimulate renewable energy, and it might also stimulate deals we were talking about in the last hour. I hope. Questions? Yeah.
I think one more addressing the carbon leakage. I think there's more like a trend towards like kind of de-globalization and shortening the supply chains. Do you think that's helping in like reducing that problem that companies move abroad because they pay a higher price here than elsewhere?
As long as the external effects are not everywhere internalized, then it would help. Because if you look at the world patterns of transport, then you see that a lot of goods are produced in, of course, low-income countries, because it's cheap to do that. These countries often also don't have this internalization. They have low energy prices. If for stability now rich countries produce more in their own region, then it's better, because that's also the region where the external costs are more internalized. And I say that because if you finally come up with what from a theoretical point of view would be the best, a world system where every country in the world has to buy these tradable permits, then it's inefficient. Because then you want that you have production in the country with the lowest environmental impact. And you don't want to block that. But currently, yes, it helps.
There's one question in the chat. In practice, how effective is the ETS in incentivizing heavy polluters who tend to be extremely wealthy and can therefore budget for the carbon they emit to switch their modes of production in the medium to long term?
The interesting thing is that I know a few extremely wealthy people, and what these extremely wealthy people don't like is to throw their money into a lake. So why are they so rich? Because they are very inventive to earn money. And if they have these rights and they don't need them, then they will immediately sell them, because that gives them even more money. So I would say, especially for these people, it works, because they're really incentivized to maximize their profit.
But isn't it also these companies that are the ones making more profit, the ones that use the cheapest energy, which is usually yeah, like is that called,
Yeah, but that is exactly what you're changing with this trading system. Because if you say, yeah, well, they earn a lot of money because they use the cheapest fuels, and the cheapest fuels have the highest effect on emissions, then they're now not cheap anymore. Because you have to buy these permits.
like I think one of the concerns is that if we truly give up on oil, gas, coal, and we only rely on sustainable energy to continue producing the level that we are producing nowadays, still these kind of energies are not going to be sustainable because, like for example, for windmills, we need like very big surfaces like to put them. So this means that, like for example, here in the Netherlands, like there aren't big forests or big like mountain ranges, so it's easy. But in other countries, like you'll need deforestation to put like solar panels, you will need to put windmills. If we want to get energy from water, usually we need to deviate like rivers to create like these waterfalls that give us energy, and all of this, like it's also altering like the environment. So like even if we move to these sustainable energies, but we keep producing in like on the level that we are producing nowadays, are they gonna truly be sustainable? Because they also have externalities.
Sure, I agree. My point would be, the last 50 years, we grew in emissions from 10 to say 35 billion tons. I'm convinced that with current technologies, you can arrive around here, 20-25 tons. Well, let's do that. Then we don't have the final solution. I'm convinced that we need technological breakthroughs to arrive at zero emissions, because you can do that locally, but not globally. But let's make the first step. Then we do a lot.
But with the technologies that you already have now, without building new technologies, like without new windmills, without new solar panels, we can reduce that much.
That is what that this study does. So they say if you look at the current call for climate change, that maximizing 1.5 degrees, then you need 36% less carbon dioxide emissions, and you can do that with current technologies. A lot can be done. So to be honest, if I look at myself, 30 years ago and now. So 30 years ago, I found it very interesting to buy a Cadillac V8, very nice car, but it consumed a bit of petrol. So every 5 kilometers, there was 1 liter gone. And I'm driving now an electric car. The solar panels on my roof, so I'm driving on solar. That's an example of what's possible, and that's not for everyone possible, but it becomes more and more profitable to do. The current electricity prices and petrol prices help a lot. So I have a son who likes driving very much. He's now talking about, okay, should I have a more efficient motor to drive? So immediately you see if the prices go up, you can react, of course. That's what you want. Yeah.
So we were talking a bit about technology earlier and then global collaboration, and you mentioned Saudi Arabia. So how could you, I guess, incentivize a country like Saudi Arabia to replace their technology for mining oil with more renewables?
Well, if you look in fact at a lot of these countries, they realize that they don't have a sustainable model.
Okay.
They know that. And they have two problems. First, they see that many countries don't want their oil anymore in long term. And the second one is that they don't like to be that dependent on one thing they are selling. So what they want to do is transferring their economy from an oil-driven economy to a service-driven economy. So they are not in the circumstances to delve other things from the earth because the rest is, well, most sand. But they have a lot of knowledge, so they're investing a lot in universities and development of human capital. You see that in Dubai, for instance. That Dubai is not anymore only driving on oil, but there's a lot of human capital working there.
But I guess I mean, this is more of a rhetorical question because I don't think it's answerable, but how do we get, to speed the process up, because it's a little bit too late for them to eventually be like, okay, well, eventually we'll invest in human capital and our oil will run out, that we kind of need that to happen like in the next 5 years, not in like 20.
Yeah, and that is what worries me the most, because, well, I showed you the picture of the last 50 years, that was not a success. And that means that we need young people like you very much to speed up this music, and you see that it helps. So the speech of Greta Thunberg was very influential. You can say, well, is it very nice for her that she's brought to this position, but it helps if young people say to the older generation, okay, it's enough and things should change.
Right.
Whether I'm optimistic, whether the speed is enough, I don't know, but, well, for personally, my point of view is okay, but you can't sit very pessimistic in your chair and say, well, it will never change. You can also contribute to what you can do. For me, is that developing science.
Right. I guess, yeah, I have like a pessimistic, optimistic point of view. But a lot of I'm from the US, and so I have kind of like a maybe so-so view of my government, and I think that they're mostly focused on money and power, and a lot of countries can follow what the US do somehow. Also a rhetorical question, but how do you get people to shift their care, like these leaders to shift their money or their care from money and power to something entirely revolving around that? I mean, the negotiations part of this is very interesting, so.
If you look at history, if you want to have drastic changes in whatever system, whether it's sustainability or not, think about human rights or slavery or every big issue, the only answer is, or it works if people are confronted with negative effects of that. For instance, if half of the Netherlands is under sea level, well, I think that other countries will say, oh, I don't want to do that. Or with elections, people vote for a better solution.
Yes.
That's are the two driving forces of change, big changes in society. And whether that's them.
I don't know. I guess I'm looking at like the most recent US election. You had 75 million people voted for Biden and 70 million people voted for Trump again. So you still have and we have like such a partisan stance in the US where it's like, you only care about the environment if you vote for Biden, and you don't care about the environment if you vote for Trump, and then it becomes this like the inequalities that you talked about and trying to get people to unite on something.
Yeah, but I don't know whether you're more optimistic or not, but if you look at this, then the United States is not that important.
Yeah.
And Europe is also not that important. I think that the current discussion in the United States about the power of the United States is a discussion of the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And that within 10 years, the power will be in China, and only in China.
Wouldn't this graph be more interesting if you could see like the CO2 emissions per capita?
Because then the US is important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because China and India have like more than double population of Europe and US.
Sure.
So a change in Europe and US per capita makes bigger impact.
Of course.
China and India.
And then, like,
But that
India,
means
China,
that this will rise even far more. Because they are currently at a far lower consumption level than in Europe and the United States. So this will double, triple, and then you're there. And that gives also the power of China compared to the United States and to Europe. So Europe is divided. I think that the United States is lost. So it's struggling currently a little bit. Of course, it's a big country, but if you look at economic figures and see what's happening in 20 years. So the simple fact that there are more solar panels installed in China than in the rest of the world last year. And the same is for roads. Of course, it can change also, but that's exactly why Trump started this fight with China, because he saw this. But I think you can change it. If you look at the history, Netherlands was once a world leader. UK was a world leader, France was it, Spain was it, Germany, Russia, then the United States, and now China time. So you can agree or not, but if you simply look at economic figures, then you see that in the last 3,000 years, 2,800 years, China was the dominant force in the world economy. The last 200 years they lost, and then now back again. And that means, in my point of view, that you have to be very close with China. Well, at least interesting. And my feeling now with this Russian war with Ukraine is that maybe 10 years later we say, hey, this was a turning point in history. Balance in power might change. In which direction, I don't know. But it's interesting times.
I have a question about what you mentioned before, like if the cost of emissions increase, then companies have incentives to change to cheaper, like relatively cheaper now, source of energy, but how do we make sure that the increased costs are not transferred to consumers through prices? Because that's also an option for companies, right? If the costs increase, they can just like increase prices and try to compensate for that instead of like changing to new sources of energy.
Yeah, but that can, in the long term, only in markets that don't function efficient. Else there will be competitors who do change to the cheaper fuel and have a lower production cost, and thus have the consumer. Of course, there are some markets who are not that competitive, but in the long term, normally that will be solved by regulators. It's only short term, probably.
I don't know about the regulations for sustainable energies, but for example, here in the Netherlands, can companies like build big solar panels and windmills, or do they depend on the government giving these lands for these purposes?
No, they can build what they want. No. The only real problem, and that's a real problem in many countries, also in the Netherlands, is the capacity of the electricity system. So often you want then from fossil fuels to electricity. We don't have the right electricity system at the moment. So I had my first Tesla 5 years ago, and then when I went to such a Tesla location to load it, then there was, well, there's 2 or 3 cars, and now it's packed. So I've now another one which has a bigger capacity so that they only need to load it at home. You see that development. Also when I look at the load infrastructure in Rotterdam, it's not enough to load all these cars that are necessary for the future. So that's a big investment we need to do.
Actually brings me to one of my questions, which is, I think I read somewhere or seen somewhere that we need to increase the investment levels for transitioning on time, let's say. But that didn't really happen. Like these big shifts in investment aren't really happening by themselves. So yeah, what from an economic point of view, what can we do, or how can we create incentives for increasing investments?
Yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm even wrong with this, but I think for like these infrastructure issues and stuff, investments increase.
So that's the reason why, at least in the Netherlands, after the last elections, the new government installed energy transition fund of 25 billion euro, which is in terms of history very large. But you have to do that. You have to finance this transition, and if you don't do that, don't stimulate it as a government, it won't happen. Unless you get the prices right.
But like, it's connected with that, but then you invest, for example, in electric cars, but they are probably a medium-term solution. They're certainly not a long-term solution, and you put a lot of money in that, in the infrastructure, but that's not the optimal. So that's a bit of a tricky decision to do as well, because optimally you move towards a better, more sustainable path right away instead of going for hybrid cars. I think was the best example, because that's even worse, and like you subsidize a lot. It's like there's no point in subsidizing that.
And the other point is that you don't know the technology. Is there a timely breakthrough technology coming? If that's the case, a very interesting example. Maybe we should end with that because 3 minutes left. In 1898, so 140 years ago, there was an international conference of world leaders about the biggest problem in all cities in the world, and it was the horse manure piling up in the streets. So it was estimated that around 1920 in London, the manure would be meters high. With a transport problem, transport infarct as a result, dead horses were lying in the street. People died from illnesses because all these flies came in the houses. They met for a week and they hadn't a solution until the car was invented. And within 20 years, there was no manure at all in the cities anymore. Okay, we had a new problem, maybe, but that is what we need, in fact. But we don't know that. So you can do 2 things. You can say, okay, then we are going to invest in what we know, or you can wait. But if you wait, if the only thing is waiting, then maybe you're too late. So my suggestion would be do both. invest in existing technology so that you decrease the emission level, please, but invest also more in new technologies because you know you need.
But by that argument, you would like invest in really efficient, like diesel and fossil fuel cars, because that's what you know, and you ban SUVs. Like you could make the existing system as efficient as possible.
Yeah, but if you look at Norway, so in Norway, more electric cars are sold currently than fossil fuel cars. And they have electricity from water, so carbon dioxide free. So that type of solution helps. In the Netherlands, you can ask that question because when my car was not driving on solar panels, I told my friends, well, my car is driving on coal. That's not so efficient.
That's country dependent.
Yeah. Okay, we have to finish. We could continue, I think, for an hour, but we will do that in the future maybe. And thank you very much.